truly remarkable thing about the gospel stories of the birth of Jesus is just how specific they are. They happen in towns to people with real names and real politicians who wield real power looking over their shoulders. There's very little vagueness here. We cannot avoid the details. So the vulnerability of the refugee child, swaddled and sleeping in the barn of a crowded city that no one took notice of, is an image that many of us hold as an emotional anchor at Christmas time. The little boy, who is in the care of faithful parents, is in a city that trembles in fear of a murderous king or an occupying power. Like our world, where so much beauty and yet so much suffering exists side by side, we get a hint at the vulnerability which is deep inside of the Christmas season. Loving and watchful meets fear and dread. In the midst of occupation and oppression of so long ago, the birth of this baby calls us to become subject to one another, all the while trusting that the creation which is subject to the Father of all mercies will provide for us and nurture us. I love Christmas carols that are a little more obscure than most. One of my favorites is an old Italian carol. It tells of an image which is very striking to me. I'm quoting now. "Sleep and dream in your thin blanket while the sky is keeping watch over your head. The sky is keeping watch, God-child, who by the shining star are showing the wise men the holy way over the mountain and over the seas." This carol reminds us of the vulnerability of Christ at Christmas, and it becomes the means by which we see and understand the holiness of the child. This baby who sleeps in his thin blanket is the motivation for the wise men to make their way to Bethlehem, and still the sky and stars look down at the child. That thin blanket that wraps the little boy, what an arresting image. In my mind, it conjures pictures of refugee families with their children wrapped in thin blankets, walking, sitting, waiting, with the sky and stars watching over them. Perhaps you're more comfortable with the cozy Christmas images, fireplaces and trees and snow and stockings filled with treats. This carol reminds us that the Christmas season makes us all vulnerable, and we realize that, like the child Jesus, we are all protected only by a thin blanket that separates us from the cold, and that we too must acknowledge that within the peace of Christmas there is still a shadow of fear and dread. Christmas is about this deeper truth, that we are all, like the child, wrapped in a very thin blanket of humanity that marks the difference between how we see ourselves and how God sees us. The Christian life is like the holy way of the wise men. We are making our way toward this child, over the mountains and over the seas. And we must never forget that what we find when we arrive at the stable is a vulnerable God, a little boy, crying in a cot. Christmas can be an extraordinarily painful time. At precisely the moment when Hallmark movies and television shows talk about being together, people find themselves alone. Family quarrels can be magnified by the holiday season. Recently ruptured relationships make absence particularly sharp. Grieving families face an intense season where the broken circle of their family is unmasked in an acute manner. Through the season of anguish in the midst of goodwill and festivity. So the grief-stricken go about their grieving surrounded by songs of the most wonderful time of the year. The blanket of our humanity is very thin indeed. The hope that surrounds us, however, is that this little boy in the thin blanket has already broken the hold of pain and suffering that we experience. This child is different because the thin blanket which veiled him has been whisked back to reveal the mighty God, the Lord of time and space, to be so in love with us that he sought out to know us as one of us. Taking our human nature upon him was a sovereign choice of love. In wearing the thin blanket of our humanity, Jesus has made all our humanity holy. This does not mean we will be preserved from sadness or loneliness or pain. The thin blanket of humanity certainly didn't protect Jesus from any of it. Rather, it has made his holiness real to us in our joy as well as our sorrow. Our fear and dread is resolved in great glory, knowing that the God who is in love with us, that he would wear our humanity that we might put on his divinity. So come to the manger, knowing that under your thin blanket, no matter how thin you might sense it to be, there is a child of God who is radiant with the love and hope that the thin blanket can barely contain. In fact, the blanket only covers over the glory which is ours when we truly turn to him and become what we were always intended to be, clothed in radiant light, blessed for all time and transformed by that vulnerable little boy. This is the message of this Christmas season. You are loved beyond your capacity to know it, and in the eyes of the Lord of all time and space, filled with his radiant glory. Happy Christmas.